Hello again. I am sometimes accused of claiming that there were no visible minorities in Britain before the arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948, which is pretty absurd. In a book of mine published 8 years ago, this one in fact, 1919, Britain's Year of Revolution, I described the race riots which took place in Britain's port cities in the summer of 1919 and the friction between black sailors and white. I probably know better than most just how many black people were actually living in London, Liverpool, and Cardiff in the early 20th century. Indeed, 6 years ago, I was invited to speak at an academic conference in Berlin on this very subject. And they were so keen on to hear my views that they paid for my airfare and hotel so I could come over there and talk about it as well. The claim, as some fools did in comments here yesterday, that I have suggested that there were no black people in the UK during the Second World War is completely mad. I do not, however, invite viewers to take my word about such matters, for I might have my own reasons for concealing or distorting the truth. Instead, we may turn to what a black person himself had to say about it. Black barrister who lived in Britain for 5 years in the early 20th century and wrote a book entirely about black people in London at that time. Here is Merriman Labour's book, which was reprinted by Penguin Books in 2022. It's called Britain Through Negro Spectacles. If anybody ought to know how many black people were living in London in the early 20th century, it was Merriman Labour. He lived there for 5 years and wrote an entire book about people in London. Let's turn to page 8 and see what an educated black person living and working in London who set out to study the black population of the city had to say. Where are we now? Yeah. Negroes in London do not much exceed 100. Negroes are simply a nonentity in the great metropolis. To every one Negro there are over 60,000 whites. In other words, the population of Greater London totals over 6 million souls. And then he goes on to explain just how few black people there were. About 100 out of a population of London of 6 million. This was in 1909, 30 years before the Second World War. There is no reason to suppose that the numbers increased dramatically over the course of those 30 years, and so, for want of any evidence to the contrary, I think it fair to assume that during the Blitz in London in 1940, there were perhaps 100 black people living in London. We should perhaps bear in mind that these were almost without exception single black men. There were, as far as is known, no black families in the capital at that time. That is to say, black men married to black women with black children. There were probably a few mixed race children, but because of the social disapproval of such liaisons, these were very, very rare. In other port cities, the situation was much the same. That is to say, in Liverpool, there might perhaps have been 60 or 100 black men. This was not a permanent population, of course. Most of these men were sailors staying in the port between ships. This was the case too in London. Very few of those 100 men actually lived permanently in the city, but were rather staying in lodging houses for a few weeks or months, sometimes for a year. This was not an established community. There were similar transient populations of Arabs, Indians, and Chinese people. I do hope that this clears matters up and that there will be no further foolish comments about my believing that there were no black people in Britain before 1948. I hope that this is very much a question of the triumph of hope over experience, for I know very well that it will not be long before I see some comment which once more claims then I am asserting that there were no black people in Britain before the arrival of the Empire Windrush.